Khorne here, and today I will be making a tier list for every Ogre unit there is. I will be ranking them based on how well they perform in the single player campaign map. So things I will take into consideration will be how well they fit with the rest of their roster, how convenient they are to recruit, how expensive they are, as well as how strong they are on the battlefield. And afterwards I will share with you how to build armies using them. Before we begin, however, we first have to understand what kinds of tactics the Ogres use when it comes to fighting battles. And for the most part, the Ogres are pretty much just a rush faction. You do have some really good ranged units, as well as some horrible ones, but for the most part, you will be trying to get into melee as quickly as possible. Partially because that is how the race is designed, with the majority of your unit roster being monstrous units that have Ogre charge, which bypasses some charge defense of your enemies. And the fact that your army abilities unlock based on how much you have charged at your enemies. The majority of your units are also very low on armor, which makes it so they aren't able to hold the line very well, and are extremely susceptible to enemy range units, which just forces you to get into melee and kill your enemies as quickly as possible. Now, the Ogres also have a few range units in their roster, but there is a rather very big issue when it comes to using them, and that is the size of your front line. Because most of your units are large, it makes it more difficult for your range units to get proper line of sight to shoot the enemy. And in most cases, they just end up dishing more damage to the backs of your own units than to your opponents. But we'll talk about this more later. So now that we have the very basic understanding of how to use Ogre armies, let's rank their units based off of that. As per usual, I will be ranking them into 5 different categories. Doomstack worthy, where these units are ridiculously strong and can be made unstoppable. Bread and butter, these units are the units you should have as the backbone of your armies. Situational units, units that aren't meant for every situation, but can be very useful in certain situations and against certain enemies. Expendable trash, these units are there just to die and buy your other units time to dish out damage. And actual trash, where I would just recommend you not recruit these units at all. So to start off with, let's take a look at their melee infantry. First up, we have Noblars and Noblar Pigback Riders. And while Noblars go into the expendable trash category, the Pigback Riders actually go into the bread and butter category. Pigback Riders actually have some decent stats that keep them in melee for much longer than regular Noblars, and while they are twice the price, they are the same tier as the regular version, take the same amount of time to recruit, but perform a much better job on the battlefield. Then we have Ogre Bulls, and I will be placing them as situational. Why? Well, they're fairly bad units, with the best one being the Ogre Bulls dual weapons, just because they have a bit more killing power than the rest. All of them are fairly weak in melee and extremely susceptible to ranged fire. But they are also the best unit you're able to recruit in the beginning, so you're kind of forced to build armies with them. And I would recommend that as soon as you're able to replace them, you do so with Iron Guts. And speaking of Iron Guts, they will go into the bread and butter category. They are a really solid unit with decent armor, mediocre killing power, but are able to hold the line fairly well. Unfortunately for them, they're still rather weak to missile units, especially against skirmish cavalry that tend to instantly kill their models. Then we have the Man-Eaters, and all of these, aside from Golgfang's Man-Eaters, go into the actual trash category. This is because of just how poorly armored they are and how little damage they dish out. Man-Eaters are basically Ogre Bulls because even though they have slightly better stats, because they have less models, they will perform exactly the same. And this is a rather big problem because they are twice as expensive as Ogre Bulls, and they take twice as long to recruit. So overall, I would just recommend you never recruit these units. They are just simply not worth it. Golgfang's Man-Eaters, however, are a Doomstack worthy unit, with decent armor, better stats than the rest of the Man-Eaters, with the ability to Vanguard deploy, as well as having a passive ability that gives them even more stats if they're ever losing in melee. This unit is definitely the best Ogre infantry unit there is, and even though they're more expensive, they are well worth it. When it comes to your missile infantry, the Nobbler Trappers will go into the situational category, just because I don't really know where to place them. I personally never recruit these units, but they could come in handy because of their Vanguard deployment and stock abilities. As for the Lead Belchers, well, this is a tough choice between situational and bread and butter. The problem is, as stated before, you can't really shoot over the heads of your front line, but they can shoot when the front line is Nobblers. I will place them in the bread and butter category, but they will definitely need specific circumstances to perform well. Man-Eaters with pistols, however, go into the trash category. They are a tier 5 unit that performs no better than the other Man-Eater melee variants, and their missile attack is rather worthless as it does minimal damage. Next up is the cavalry, and all of them will go into the bread and butter category. They all have relatively high speed, a decent amount of armor, and a good amount of killing power. Their only problem is that the difference between them is only in stat numbers, and the difference in variance is very much negligible. Crushers are going to perform better than Mournfang Cavalry though, and they take the same amount of time to recruit. So I would recommend that you recruit the higher tier variants whenever possible. Next we have your monstrous units, and almost all of these are amazing. The Saber Tusks go into the situational category. I usually don't recruit them unless I absolutely have to, but they can be relatively decent at shutting down enemy range. The Blood Vultures are surprisingly good with high damage, the fact they can fly, and the fact they are able to trigger your army ability almost instantly. They definitely go into the bread and butter category. Gorgers are going into the Doomstack category with good damage, the ability to stalk, and they can now heal when in melee from their technology. Overall, just a really good unit. Yetis are surprisingly versatile, with some magic attack to deal with physical resistance, and an aura that lowers the melee defense of nearby enemy units. They are a really good unit to bring in almost all of your armies, so I will be placing them as bread and butter. Next are Giants, and well, they instantly go into trash tier. While you are able to heal them a minuscule amount, you aren't really able to buff them as much as you are with other races, so they are just extremely vulnerable to missiles. Stonehorns and Thunder Tusks both go into the Doomstack category. No matter which version you choose, they all perform a decent job at killing the enemy. But I would recommend that you recruit Thunder Tusks over Stonehorn Harpoon Launchers, as with magic attack they are much more versatile on the battlefield. Finally, artillery, and honestly think that both of these are pretty terrible. The Nobbler Scrap Launchers are probably the worst of the two, as they more often miss than they hit something, so they just end up wasting their ammo. This is not even mentioning the fact that they are horrible to micromanage, as they will regularly just get stuck in each other and refuse to fire. So I will place them as situational only when you absolutely have nothing better to recruit. Now, even though Iron Blasters are better at killing enemies and are more accurate, they have such a ridiculous reload time that after firing one shot, you will have to wait half a minute before you can fire again. Now, they can be made to be really good in the later stages of your campaign when you researched all of their technologies, gave them all of the redline skill buffs from your lords, and got them up to tier 9. But this takes a really long time to achieve, so because of this, I will place them as situational as well. When it comes to your lords, I usually always get the Paymaster to lead my armies, as they have a pretty good skill tree for it. Slaughtermasters are pretty good as well, and they're more competent on the battlefield with them being spellcasters, but they're a little bit worse when it comes to leading your armies. Finally, I would advise you just never recruit Tyrants. The only thing they are good at is being in melee and nothing more. So I really just don't see any point in recruiting them. As for your heroes, Butchers and Hunters are a must-have in every single one of your armies. Hunters because they provide bonus campaign movement, as well as some buffs for your monstrous units, and Butchers because they provide you with some extra casualty replenishment, as well as being a spellcaster. Fire bellies are nothing more than fire wizards, so having them in your armies isn't a top priority, and bruisers are usually best if you have multiple of them in a single army to kill high value targets. Alright, so now when it comes to actually building your armies, this is a bit tricky. Like I said in the beginning, ogres are a rush faction, so ranged units don't work really well with them, unless you have a nobler front line. But that being said, nobblers are a very unreliable unit to hold the line. They are, however, very good at dying instead of your ogres. So in the beginning of your campaign, when you can recruit nothing but ogre bulls and nobblars, I would recommend you have 5 units of nobblars to soak up damage for the rest of your army, 6 to 8 units of ogre bulls to actually dish out some damage, and the rest of your army should be blood vultures or saber tusks to shut down enemy ranged. The ogre bulls aren't really an amazing unit, but it's the only reliable source of damage you will have in the beginning, so you will have to recruit them in the majority of your armies. Having a few fast units like saber tusks or blood vultures will help you out in shutting down enemy ranged and keeping your ogre bulls from just getting annihilated. However, after you built up your camps to tier 3, there is an army you can make that will last you for the rest of your campaign. You'll want to have 6 to 8 iron guts for a decent front line, 4 to 6 yetis for a supportive unit, and 4 to 6 Mournfang cavalry for some flanking and to reach the enemy back line. Now, this army I found to be really good, but it also struggles a lot when it comes to fighting against skirmish armies, so do be careful where you bring it. Fighting Cathay, for example, would be fine, but when fighting against Snitch and his ninja rats, you will have a bad time. Overall, this army composition I found to work the best, and if you don't have access to yetis, you can just get more iron bellies, Mournfang cavalry, or even some stone horns. Finally, for the last of your sort of standard armies, we have lead belchers with a nobler front line. The combination of these two units is able to demolish almost any enemy they go up against. Needless to say, however, that your front line won't last for very long, but so long as you kill the enemy before the noblars run away, you should be good. I would recommend you bring this army against opponents that are slower on the battlefield, and especially to bring it against fighting Nurgle, as ogres have a horrible time in melee versus Nurgle armies. It is also in this type of army where I would recommend you bring Iron Blasters, if you really wanted to use them. I would just recommend that you don't recruit them before you have researched all of their associated technologies. Now, before we move on to the Doomstacks, there is an army that I have had a bit of success with, and that is the Blood Vulture spam. This isn't a Doomstack by any means, and it definitely performs worse than your standard armies, but they are a bit cheaper and they perform better versus ranged focus factions. I would only advise you not bring it against melee focus factions like the Warriors of Chaos, as even though they can dish out good damage, they are extremely squishy and will die easily in melee. For the end, we have the Doomstacks. First up is the Gorger Doomstack. With them being able to heal now with Gore Feast, they don't even need to be in Scragg's army to perform amazingly well. They have high killing power and some decent survivability. Then we have the Stonehorn and Thunder Tusks armies. All of these are relatively good, they just take a rather long time to recruit and are really expensive to maintain. And the last one, we have Golgfang's Maneater Doomstack. These Maneaters make for an absolutely amazing Doomstack, with them being able to Vanguard deploy into their opponents. They have some amazing survivability with high armor, a good amount of health, and they can kill the enemy relatively quickly. Well, that is pretty much all I had to share with you when it comes to building up your ogre armies. If you enjoyed the video and would like to watch more of these, don't forget to subscribe for future content. Thank you all for watching, and until next time.
Khorne fights as one.